Today we're going to take a look at slavery and its influence on the development of the Americas. And now this goes directly back to our standard, which is going to have us describe the influence of African slavery on the development of the Americas. Slavery has been around since the time of antiquity. Ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Romans all had slaves. It even became common practice in Africa once agriculture spread to all parts of the continent. Farm owners, needing people to work their land, would soon force people captured from battles. A detailed system for the capture, sale, and distribution of slaves was set in place by many African kingdoms and tribes over 500 years prior to Cortez's conquest over the Aztecs and Pizarro's conquest over the Inca. Most slaves in Africa were war captives, and once enslaved, had no individual rights. Meanwhile, the empires of the Spanish and Portuguese are growing immensely. With the conquest of Latin America, the need to find cheap labor has become a dire necessity. Gold and silver made both Spain and Portugal extremely rich. However, both countries wanted more, so more mines were made. But to fill these mines, they needed people. Also, cash crops like sugar cane and tobacco were in high demand and grew great in Latin America's climate. But to farm these, they needed people. And what's better than bringing people to where you need them to be? Not having to pay them. So, were Native Americans slaves? At first, yes, but eventually, most natives died from diseases like smallpox, or, being familiar with the surrounding areas, just escaped into the nearby mountains or jungles or even forests. The Europeans had to look elsewhere. So why Africa? Political fragmentation meant there was no African king or president that would declare war against a European power for kidnapping their citizens. Also, sailing from Africa to the Americas was particularly easier due to its geographic proximity. Basically, it was just closer. Also, high birth rates in Africa meant there was a large availability of a young workforce, i.e., slaves, that the Europeans could come and pilfer. Many Africans also had specific agricultural skills that would have proved to particular use on a plantation. This was the Spanish thinking. The Portuguese slave trade began a few years prior to that of the Spanish, after they discovered uninhabited islands off of an African coast and decided to build sugar plantations upon them. They needed workers, and they also needed to populate their new colony. They turned to Africa, and they didn't ask, though, if the citizens of Africa wanted to come and live on their plantation. Before long, it is discovered that sugarcane thrives in the Latin American humid climate. Portuguese entrepreneurs soon offer their newfound product, aka slave labor, to plantation owners in South America. Before long, Brazil is the most profitable sugar-producing land or colony in the world. Slavery expands. In 1518, the first shipment of slaves went directly from West Africa to the Caribbean, where the slaves worked on sugar plantations. By the 1520s, the Spanish had introduced slaves to Central and South America, where they worked as farmers and as miners. By 1600, the British had begun bringing African slaves to America. The demand for slave labor in the Western Hemisphere stimulated a profitable triangular trade route between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. European manufactured goods, such as clothes and firearms, went to Africa, where they would be exchanged for slaves. The slaves were then shipped from Africa to the Caribbean and America, where they were sold for cash or sometimes traded for other goods. Then, ships would return to Europe with the raw materials that were produced by the slaves. So, manufactured goods could be produced in Europe and then taken back down to Africa and traded for more slaves. And here's a bigger picture. Following capture, slaves were force-marched to holding pens before being loaded onto ships. This transatlantic journey was from the Africa to America is known as the Middle Passage. The ships were filthy, hot, and overcrowded. Mortality rates were as high as 50%. And here again we have a bigger picture. As you can see, the sail from Angola to Brazil would have been the shortest, and that of Angola to British North America and the colonies would have been the longest. If a slave was fortunate enough to survive the Middle Passage and arrive to their plantation or their mine, they were plagued by disease, brutal working conditions, poor sanitation, and hunger. This naturally resulted in high mortality rates. Plantation owners imported mainly male slaves, which coupled the high mortality rates with low birth rates. In order to maintain the demand for slaves, the Atlantic slave trade had to import a steady stream of slaves, totaling upwards of 15 million. Nearly all of the wealth from slavery was sent back to the colony's European mother country. The African slave labor force helped to build many Latin American countries. But since the wealth was sent back to Europe, many Latin American countries are now still poor and feel the effects of slavery from over 400 years ago. Marriages between people from different cultures produce a diverse culture, though. People with both African and European ancestry live in large numbers throughout Latin America and make up 60% of Cubans and 50% of Brazilians. So the four big impacts of slave trade in Latin America, let's sum it up quick. Language, religion, music, and food.